Canada passed the women's suffrage legislation in 1918, but Asian Canadians couldn't vote until the 1940s, while the Indigenous Canadians did not have suffrage until 1960.
In Australia, Indigenous women are only allowed to vote 60 years after non-Indigenous women were allowed to vote.
In South Africa, Black women waited 63 more years compared to their white counterparts.
In Iceland, the government set the minimum wage for women to vote to 40 years old in 1915, while the age for men was 25 at the time.
In India, voting rights were expanded to women in 1935, but only to those who possessed a specific literacy qualification or married to a male voter.
In Ecuador, the country originally only extended the franchise to literate women in 1929, despite being the first Latin American country to grant women voting rights. It was not until 1979 that the literacy requirement was dropped completely.
In the US, more than 4 decades passed between the 19th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which finally took aim at the discriminatory state and local restrictions that had prevented African Americans from voting.
At least 19 nations originally limited suffrage for women of certain backgrounds based on factors like age, education level, race, or marital status. Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in for our podcast today. On this side of the internet is Cyrus and Khanh. After listening to the shocking facts in the beginning, you might be wondering, just what is this podcast about? I'll turn this question to Khanh. So Khanh, what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th to early 20th century in the US and the UK. If you look up the women's suffrage movement on the internet, most likely you will find information about the 19th Amendment passed in the US, or how about the World War resulted in increased women participation in the economy and politics in the United Kingdom, and how that empowered them to fight for suffrage.
It sounds like an era of empowerment.
Indeed, in fact, some historians refer to the 30 years between 1890 and 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed as the women's era. But instead of introducing the common narrative of women's suffrage, today we want to explore why the women did not benefit all women the same way.
Can you share more with the audience what you mean by that?
Sure. We want to see how these suffrage movements exploited other oppressed alternate identities such as races and become accomplished in the system of oppression.
And before we take on this mainstream narrative, let's take a step back and dive into the historical context first and understand, why did women not have suffrage right in the first place?
Yeah, and more specifically, why did men not grant women suffrage rights?
When I was doing research about why women couldn't vote, I came across this Atlantic article explaining that the main reason was women were not considered to be smart enough, and that spending time thinking and involving in politics would exhaust their already scarce mental power. And if women did not have enough mental capacity, they would have insufficient energy to reproduce and they would become infertile.
Yeah. Multiple researchers about human skulls' physical differences between sexes in the 19th century concluded that women's brains were smaller and that this deficiency would lead to less intelligent brains.
And even though this already sounds very confusing and sounds like pseudoscience, another point that was also very perplexing was how these quote-unquote scientific research about female body associated women with other minorities, or quoting these research, the lower race, such as immigrants or children, with respect to their intelligence. It was argued that both women and these other racial minorities show more primitive and childlike traits such as impulsiveness and lack of originality compared to the white grown-up men.
So throughout the 19th century, the dominant player in society, typically white men, was using this scientific claim that women in racial minorities lacked the intelligence and capacity to engage with politics and public affairs, to pack up the social order they could create, to oppress and exclude these subaltern groups from participating in the social and political decision-making process.
Yeah, and these historical examples of people with power hiding behind science to justify their discriminatory actions is really alerting us to identify the biases that corrupt the production of something that we consider to be authoritative and objective.
Exactly.
And so now that we've got some context of the pre-women's suffrage movement era, shall we move on to uncovering how the women's suffrage movement did not benefit all women the same way?
Yes.
So Khanh, which area are we going to first?
First, let's talk about the US.
I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothingness and selfishness, it is the white women of America.
The narrative around women's suffrage in the US has been centered around white, middle-class women. The story usually began at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention in the US. Many people attribute the success of the movement to the leading activists such as SisumD Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And often, the story ends with the US passing the 19th Amendment in 1920, which, quote, guarantees all American women the right to vote.
But something is missing in the story, isn't it?
Indeed, very little was known about the participation of women of color in the women's suffrage in the US. The struggle they faced after the 19th Amendment with discriminatory states and local restrictions was also excluded from the story.
I see. So why don't we start by learning more about the contributions of these lesser-known suffragists?
Let's first introduce Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, also known as Frances Harper. She was an African-American abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer. In May 1866, Harper addressed the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City, where she sat at a platform with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and SisumD Anthony, the suffragists that we all know about. Let's listen to some of the quotes from Harper as she talked about the experience of being a woman of color and the problem of oppressing people with color.
You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's against me. I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. While there exists this brutal element in society, which tramples upon the feeble and threads of the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothingness and selfishness, it is the white women of America.
So Khanh, how did you feel when you were listening to Harper's speech?
Shocking and very upset. This speech unfolds the untold story of racism that the women's suffrage movement fails to resolve. But what is more shocking was the controversial comments that the famous white suffragists Stanton and Anthony made after the passing of the 15th Amendment, which allowed black men to vote before white women. Anthony was quoted saying, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." While Staten was quoted saying, "It is better to be the slave of an educated white man than of the degraded, ignorant black one."
It was alarming to see the white suffragists throwing their allies off the bus in this complex political struggle to gain support from racist dominant group. They chose to dissociate themselves from other black suffragist clubs because admitting them might jeopardize the relationship that the white suffragists had with the southern state governments.
And besides the struggle that women of color faced before the 19th Amendment, let's also note that not all women in the US were practically allowed to vote until more than 4 decades after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. 2020 was the anniversary of 100 years after that 19th Amendment. In the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, many groups and institutions organized exhibitions with portraits of women of color activists to honor their contributions in advancing women's suffrage. There are a few good ones, like the exhibition named Votes for Women, a Portrait of Persistence by the National Portrait Gallery. There were portraits of 60 female activists and a third of whom were women of color. However, we can also identify issues with these projects, such as the exhibition of the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. The exhibition claimed to not have some portraits of some activists, while in fact, the photographs are widely available.
I think this example serves as a good reminder for historians and activists that when we are trying to restore justice for the underprivileged group, we need to be extra cautious about the way that we represent them and we represent these untold stories so that we could avoid creating more silence in the process.
On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in the UK, the participation of women of color, especially Indian British, in the women's suffrage movement is also largely unheard of.
In 1918, the UK Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act, which expanded the voting rights to women who were over the age of 30 and a member or married to a member of the local government register, a property owner, or a graduate voting in a university constituency. But with these restrictions, there were only around 40% of the women at the time that was actually able to vote.
Among the suffragists who fought to include more women, there was an Indian woman that was highly influential in the movement, Sophia Tulip Singh. She came from a privileged background by being the daughter of an exiled Indian prince, Maharaja Tulip Singh, who was a favorite of Queen Victoria. She herself was a goddaughter of Queen Victoria. Singh was heavily involved in the Women's Tax Resistance League, an association that advocated for women to not pay taxes, as they didn't have the right to vote. Their motto was, "No taxation without representation."
Singh also led one of the big suffrage demonstrations in 1910, known as Black Friday, with Emmeline Pankhurst, along with some other demonstrations.
But that's as much as we know about the contribution of Indian women in the suffrage movement. Much is known about Singh thanks to her background, but other than that, little is known about the involvement of other women because of the influence of imperialism on the British suffrage movement. Dr. Sumita Keche, an historian of the British Empire and Indian subcontinent, summarized this with, Sophia Tulip Singh was someone who has a voice, but the other Indian women who were involved, they did not have a voice.
And recently, there is actually a rare photograph discovered in the Women's Library archives at the London School of Economics and Political Science. The photo shows a church league for a women's suffrage meeting in Brighton on 2nd of July in 1913. Among over 70 people, there were two women that were identified to be Indian. One was Dr. Susila Anita Banerjee, who was the secretary of the Ealing branch of the Church League for Women's Suffrage. The other woman is considered to be either her sister Nellie Blair or possibly a sister-in-law Amia, who visited Susila in 1912 to 1913.
Dr. Sumita Mukherjee commented about the photo that this is a remarkable archival find as there is such little photographic evidence of the involvement of women of Indian ethnicity in the British suffrage movement. Britain was very racially and ethnically diverse in the 1910s, but very few women of color were encouraged to join the British suffrage movement.
As we can see, the British suffrage movement was influenced by imperialism, and thus they excluded the Indian British from the course of action, which is similar to the US example that we saw. The Indian British were only involved when the British suffragists needed the exotic phase as part of their diversity agenda. But when the Indian British women's involvement clashed with the imperialist ideology, the British suffragists just quickly dissociated themselves. A question popped in my head as we went through the examples of women's suffrage movement in the US and UK. And it is, why would one underprivileged group abandon or sacrifice other underprivileged group who fought alongside them in the battle? As we learned earlier, they were all oppressed by the same group with the same standard that they were not intelligent enough. And even though the level of oppression was definitely not the same across these different groups, they did band together at some point during the movement to fight alongside each other. So why didn't the allyship last? Why do we see that in so many countries? the women's suffrage movement progress still mirror the many facets of systemic injustice.
Before we dig into some answers, I want to share an excerpt of a quote that circulated the internet around June 2021. If you collect 100 black ants and 100 fried ants and put them in a glass jar, nothing will happen. But if you take the jar, shake it violently, and leave it on the table, the ants will start killing each other. The rest believe that the black is the enemy, while the black believes that the rest is the enemy, when the real enemy is the person who shook the jar. The same is true in society. Before we fight each other, we must ask ourselves, who dropped the jar?
I think this is an interesting analogy that gets us to think from a more systemic level instead of attributing the cause to individuals who took the actions.
Exactly. One concept that might be helpful in understanding the mechanism underlying the divine within the movement is ethnocentrism. In a journal article named The Ethnocentric Basis of Social Science Knowledge Production, the author argued that the dominant group holds the power to socialize subordinate groups and condition them to act according to the rules by the dominant group. We can observe a similar phenomenon in the US, example, where the white suffragists divorced from the racial equality movement to sign with the existing dominant group for their support and acknowledgement.
This echoes another example in the same journal article, which shows that, and I quote, although poor and working class whites have lower levels of income and education, they're still privileged in being white. These controversial statements that we have heard from the white suffragists like Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton suggest that they were resorting to this membership in the racially dominant group to bully other racial minorities that threaten their political status. Even though science lumped white women and racial minorities together, they strategically resorted to other types of differences to dissociate themselves from the racial minorities. In Mandarin, there is a slang called 弱弱相残, which translates to the weak competing against and incapacitate each other. It is similar to the idea of infighting, a strategy that colonialists often used where the colonialists pitted one underprivileged group against another to directly or indirectly rig the game. Research has also pinpointed infighting phenomenon with respect to the public attitude to social minority groups. It argues that public perception towards social minorities positively correlates with the level of income equality. When income equality decreases, the public tends to be more intolerant towards the social minorities.
So to rectify the injustice experienced by the Black women and South Asian women who were left oblivious, we should not only give them the voice back and recognize the problems in the women's suffrage movement, but also call out the systemic issues that nudged the movement to take the course it took.
Exactly. And I think this is an important lesson about activism that we can learn from the women's suffrage movement. And it really goes back to that analogy about ant. Before we fight each other, we must ask ourselves, who rocked the jar? Before we let you go, we've got a few questions for you to help you rethink and challenge the narrative about women's suffrage movement.
Look up on your favorite browser the term women's suffrage movement, following the topic of identifying historical silence. Give a critical look at the top results. What type of silence do you see here?
We will share our observation after the music, and you're welcome to stop here to look it up yourself first before continuing to the next part.
Before we share our observations, we would like to invite you to share your insights with us first, as you might identify interesting topics that historians can look into. Please leave a comment down below the kind of historical silence that you think is present in the search results.
If you have left a comment, thank you for the participation. The kind of historical silence that Khanh and I want to call out is that most of the top results on Google feature the women's suffrage movement in the US and UK. Sources on women's suffrage movement in other countries were rather limited and harder to find. Which begs the question, does this come from the lack of attention on other countries' suffrage movement in the English-speaking academia? Or is this because women's rights groups in other countries did not create enough resources to document their own history? Or is this because of the algorithm that prioritized women's suffrage movement in the US and UK based on their popularity, which in turn make these resources even more accessible compared to other resources?
These are the observations that we had while making this podcast. This friction in finding useful sources about the women's suffrage movement nudged us to introduce the history of the women's suffrage movement through the examples of the US and the UK. This podcast is by no means a comprehensive history of the women's suffrage movement. There are more stories about the suffrage movement in different countries, regions, and the nuanced way they are experienced by individuals participating in these movements. We hope that our podcast has served as a good entry point for you to critically engage with the narrative of women's suffrage movement. Thank you so much for listening to us. This is Khanh.
And this is Cyrus.